G'day friends and foes, this is TINLA number 16 and it is references part 1 of 2 because I don't want the video to go forever, so I'll do another section of references that mainly covers points made in TINLAs 14 and 15, but this is references for TINLAs 14, 15 and 17. None of this is legal advice and this is the references for the claims that I've made. So many of you would have seen this video that I made last night, which was TINLA 17. So it's entitled Arjay's ANZAC Day Eve Message to the Police and Military of Australia, New Zealand and the World, TINLA 17. So as it says, please share everywhere to all of your friends and foes. Friends and foes is, I guess, my little catchphrase. To all groups that you can. Arjay's ANZAC Day Eve message to the police, military and police of Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the UK and the rest of the world. TINLA 17. It's got Dr. W. John Martin's YouTube link, which is doctor I mentioned about the contamination of vaccines and blood products by stealth-adapted viruses of a zoonotic nature, i.e. from non-human animals. There's these viruses and they're stuck in people through injections, and then people that have been vaccinated do go on often and provide blood products to other people, so it's another way of transmission, as well as there's STD components, say, of simian vacuolating or vacuolating virus 40, also called simian virus 40. And then it's also got a donation link. If someone wants to donate some money, then that would be very helpful. So that's paypal.me/Arjay Martin. So firstly, we'll look at some stuff about Bill Gates. So there you see him there. So William Henry Gates III. So as we scroll down, we'll find that he did not actually graduate from a university. So he graduated from Lakeside School, which is presumably a high school. He did very well in his SAT test, so he must be a smart chappy, obviously. He enrolled at Harvard in 1973 and he chose pre-law and took mathematics and graduate level computer science courses instead. So, and he was 17. It wasn't like he was one of the child geniuses that start university when they're 12 years old or 14 years old. I myself was at university at 17 doing a Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Teaching, dual degrees. So anyway, so he dropped out of Harvard in 1975 and says his parents were supportive after seeing how much he wanted to start his own company. And he explained later, if things hadn't worked out, I could always go back to school. I was officially on leave. He was also involved with like Rotary International in relation to polio, etc. Is he a medical doctor, however? He's seen as the go-to for all his vaccination stuff. Does he have a medical degree? Does he have a epidemiology degree or vaccinology degree or some kind of training like that? The answer is that he does have medical degree in the form of a honorary Doctor of Medicine. He's also, and that's through the Karolinska Institute. So he also has honorary doctorates of law, as David Meyer on Quora suggests. he doesn't think that he has and can't find evidence, whatever, of him having a PhD. So, why would, say, Harvard give him a Doctor of Laws when he dropped out and didn't even finish a bachelor's degree? As we can see in this article by Deutsch 29, so Mercedes Schneider's blog, I'm not sure who she is exactly, but this was convenient to use this link. So he was invited to speak at Harvard University's graduation ceremony in 2007, and he was awarded an honorary doctorate. That is after 11 years of donating money to Harvard, so $262 million in the form of 97 grants. So then it's got the joke about talking about paying for a college degree. So, you give $250 million to an institute, even though, things could well be happening in the background, i.e. the grants could include, work in return for that. So, say grants for people studying something that Bill has an interest in, either a vested interest or, general interest in it. Next, this says about the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and it was given in support of their scientific work on global health issues through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've made an active and long-term contribution to improving human health where the need is greatest, the Karolinska Institute said. That's also debatable since apparently Bill Gates is banned from many African countries and also from India in relation to their polio vaccination program, where there's been massive incidences of acute flaccid paralysis, so-called non-polio, that kind of thing, but that's subject for another video. So they also have, positive news articles that he's so generous, giving billions of dollars for pandemic relief. So we go down, and the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation, will presumably done through their foundation, has given 255 million US dollars for treatment and vaccine development. Yet how can you put it nicely, or whatever. So with the treatment and vaccine development, is it really a donation or is it an investment of some kind? So there's been a lot of statements going around claiming that Bill Gates has a patent on the coronavirus. The coronavirus is actually a family of viruses. There's two basically families of it and hundreds of different strains, potentially, maybe even more. So the claim goes that Bill Gates, through a institute called the Peerbright Institute, that they have a patent on creating the coronavirus. So coronaviruses make up to 15 to 25% of all so-called common colds, or create 15 to 25% of so-called common colds. It is not a new thing, even though this SARS coronavirus number 2 is a new strain, which may well be intentionally made, or maybe it is a type of stealth adapted virus or zoonotic virus from a vaccine, that kind of thing. So the Pirbright Institute, it says, is a biological research organisation based in Surrey, England, and they specialise in studying animal viruses and zoonotic disease transferred from animals to people. They do hold a patent for coronavirus. They're saying that primarily affects chickens, but they don't hold a patent to do with the coronavirus disease 19 pandemic. Really, whenever you write corona or COVID-19, it should be big C, little o, big V, little I, big D for coronavirus disease 2019. So apparently the Pirbright Institute told USA Today, this newspaper or TV station, it has some kind of web presence, I take it, stated, the Institute was granted a patent in 2018 which covers the development of an attenuated, weakened form of coronavirus that could potentially be used as a vaccine to prevent respiratory diseases in birds, including IBV and other animals. So if we actually go to the patent, which is here, or this is not the actual patent, but summary of it or index of it. So you see for coronavirus, that doesn't mean it is for the current coronavirus. And Pirbright Institute, blah, blah, blah. So with the abstract, it says the present invention provides a live attenuated coronavirus comprising a variant replicase gene encoding polyprotein comprising a mutation in one or more of non-structural protein or proteins. Then it's got the protein numbers listed. The coronavirus may be used as a vaccine for treating and or preventing a disease such as infectious bronchitis in a subject. So nothing about that says that it's only for chickens. And sure, they might well have gotten a bird flu type coronavirus, or a bird cold technically, but that's beside the point. So avian infectious bronchitis virus. So that doesn't mean that it only applies to birds. It's just the location that they retrieved the virus was probably from birds. Anyway, so I'll go back to that one in a second. Now, this has changed windows. That's helpful. Not. So, going down. So, Gates funding the foundation. It's confirmed here that they have provided 2 grants, and then they say one for this purpose, one for that purpose, in which case the money's there anyway, so really the purpose can change with the permission of the donor. This is annoying because it keeps changing. But anyway, so it's like a lot of famous people get these speaking fees, and they do things in return that aren't related to the speaking. So that could well be the case. It also might not be the case, but maybe this funding was used for other purposes as well. So next we have a little bit about Microsoft, or a competitor to Microsoft that, depending on who you listen to, Bill Gates acquired some intellectual property or copied it and was going to be sued by a bloke called Gary Kildall. And apparently he was such a lovely bloke, and he just quickly scroll through, try and keep things in order. But so he made a product called CP/M, and he basically claimed that Bill Gates stole his invention or copied it. And as this article by Forbes says, Kildall was bitter. He said DOS, which Microsoft bought from Seattle Computer Products, copycatted all of the best features of CP/M, and that Gates then made DOS just differently enough to be incompatible with CP/M. He threatened to sue but never did. And then he had to compete in a market against what he saw as his own product, and he ended up being bought out, and he went into a bar and was wearing motorcycle leathers with Harley Davidson patches and says a would-be biker, yet it's very important for motorcycle users to use leathers, including boots and gloves and helmet and whatever, for their own protection, so they don't fall off, or if they do fall off, they don't get road rash and get skinned alive, flayed. But anyway, this little article says there were some real bikers in the bar. Something was said. There was pushing and shoving, and Kildall died from injuries sustained to his head, which it doesn't go into details. So there was an inquest, and it claimed the death was suspicious, but no one was ever charged. Reminds me of a Finnish man who came up with the so-called Bock saga, who was Eeyore Bock, who was murdered with being stabbed to death by some people in his apartment in Helsinki, or Espoo, which is next door to Helsinki, I think it might have been, and no one was ever charged, magically. At least I guess he didn't shoot himself 5 times in the back of the head or hang himself from a doorknob. Anyway, so now we have, scroll up. So this is Whitfield, which is a Tasmanian lobster case. It's also called the crayfish case. This is the High Court, 1988, and it interprets Section 92 of the Constitution, and summarised, it should have the actual quote here of Section 92, but if not, I have that open anyway. So I want section, or paragraph 18 really. Here you go. So it says in paragraph 17 about the interpretations of Section 92. This case is famous for being the first case in the High Court to actually use Quick and Garron's constitutional commentaries, also called the Annotated Constitution, which a lot of people mistake for being the actual Constitution, but it's basically a guidebook to the Constitution. It includes the Constitution. So should be at 18. So they basically summarize about, the intercourse among the states shall be absolutely free. And you see Section 92 of the Constitution. Then it states quite clearly, the purpose of the section is clear enough: to create a free trade area throughout the Commonwealth and to deny to Commonwealth and states alike a power to prevent or obstruct the free movement of people, goods and communications across state boundaries. So as you'll see, it also says about free movement of people. It's not just about trade and commerce. So I'll read it again. So paragraph 18 of Whitfield. The purpose of the section is clear enough: to create a free trade area throughout the Commonwealth and to deny to Commonwealth and states alike a power to prevent or obstruct the free movement of people, goods, and communications across state boundaries. So then it also goes on, which I discuss later anyway, but about some exceptions in, paragraph 23. It says about, where is it? So, for example, although personal movement across a border cannot, generally speaking, be impeded, it is legitimate to restrict a pedestrian's use of a highway for a purpose of his crossing. So, someone walking across a highway, you can say people can't walk on highways because it's dangerous if cars going 110 k's an hour or 100 k's an hour or whatever. Also, to authorise the arrest of a fugitive offender from one state at the moment of his departure into another. So as I covered about, police are special constables in other states anyway, so it's kind of irrelevant that people would suggest that, if you're a criminal and you cross the border, then you 1 metre across the border and you pull down your pants and moon the police and say, no, you can't get me. That isn't reality, for Australia at least. Next, we have the first uniform tax case. And I'll go up the top. So South Australia versus the Commonwealth, first uniform tax case, 1942, HCA 14. So, as you can see here, it says, and this is paragraph, this doesn't have paragraphs, which isn't very helpful, but it's from Chief Justice Latham, and you can count the paragraphs if you really like. But anyway, common expressions such as the courts have declared a statute invalid sometimes lead to misunderstanding. A pretend law made in excess of power is not and has never been law at all. Anybody in the country is entitled to disregard it. Naturally, he will feel safer if he has a decision of a court in his favour, but such a decision is not an element which produces invalidity in any law. The law is not valid until a court pronounces against it, and thereafter invalid. If it is beyond power, it is invalid ab initio. So ab initio means from the beginning. Sorry, I'm losing my voice too from doing a late night video last night. But as you can see, yes, this is the most important little part of it. A pretend law made in excessive power is not and never has been a law at all. Anybody in a country is entitled to disregard it. We also have, I think that one was supposed to be bookmarked in this little section, which is, if either the Commonwealth Parliament or a state parliament attempts to make a law which is not within its powers, the attempt fails because the alleged law is unauthorised and is not a law at all. When both the Commonwealth Parliament and the State Parliament have power to make laws, then in case of inconsistency, the Commonwealth law prevails and a state law, to the extent of the inconsistency, is invalid. Section 109 of the Constitution, that also assumes that the Commonwealth law is in fact valid. But as you can see, if the government, let's just call it that, or if a parliament attempts to make a law which is not within the powers, the attempt fails. And the law, or purported law, is unauthorised and therefore no law at all. A parliament of limited powers cannot arrogate a power to itself by attaching a label to a statute. So the government cannot make up laws and give itself powers that it does not have. Next we have the Australian Communist Party against the Commonwealth, the Communist Party case, 1951, HCA 5. So from McTiernan, justice, and J afterwards means is a justice or a judge. So with this case, the government tried reciting itself into power, saying at the start that, this is made under XYZ power, and it was deemed invalid anyway. So it was to dissolve the Communist Party, in which case there was the Cold War on, which was a war against the communists. So it's one of the most important decisions of the High Court. Change the brightness of the screen too. The Constitution does not allow the judicature to concede the principle that the Parliament can conclusively recite itself into power. Also here, Parliament cannot recite itself into a field the gates of which are locked against it by superior law. So in other words, laws have to be compliant to the Constitution, and really the Constitution has to be compliant to the so-called social contract, the powers that they were originally given. And then it says about the example given by Latham, Chief Justice, was considered in the first uniform tax case that we just heard about. And there he said, such a declaration cannot be regarded as conclusive. A parliament of limited powers cannot arrogate a power to itself by attaching a label to a statute. Next we have, it may be thought, and therein lies an exception to an elementary rule of constitutional law, which has been expressed metaphorically by saying that a stream cannot rise higher than its source. It was stated in Shrimpton against the Commonwealth, 1945, per Dixon, in these terms. Finality in a sense of complete freedom from legal control is a quality which cannot be given under our Constitution to a discretion if, ... it is capable of being exercised for purposes or given an operation which would or might go outside the power from which a law or regulation conferring the discretion derives its force. And it goes on, compare with Dawson against Commonwealth, blah blah blah. The validity of a law or of an administrative act done under law cannot be made to depend on the opinion of the lawmaker or the person who is to do the act. That the law or the consequences of the act is within the constitutional power upon which the law in question itself depends for its validity. A power to make laws with respect to lighthouses does not authorize the making of a law with respect to anything which is, in the opinion of the lawmaker, a lighthouse. A power to make a proclamation carrying legal consequences with respect to a lighthouse is one thing. A power to make a similar proclamation with respect to anything which is in the opinion of the Governor-General is a lighthouse is another thing. Whether the rule exemplified by Lloyd and Wallach, 1915, constitutes a real or only an apparent exception to the general rule is a matter which need not be considered here. It is enough to say, on the one hand, it is established beyond all doubt, while, on the other hand, it has never yet been invoked except in connection with the secondary aspect of the defence power, which has so far been regarded as depending upon a basic fact of emergency, and ceasing when conditions created by the emergency have passed. So as you can see here, you got the concept of quarantine and the validity of a law or a regulation done under a law cannot be made to depend upon the opinion of the lawmaker or the person who's doing the act, including in our case, the chief medical officers of the various states and territories, as an example. And then in our case, we're changing lighthouses for quarantine because that's the only power that the Commonwealth Government has in relation to, COVID-19, really. And basically, people can't just make up that something is to do with quarantine when it is not, i.e. the internal border controls and locking everyone in their house, treating them like sex offenders and rapists and whatever, if ankle bracelet GPS, where the government wants to do GPS tracking on your mobile phone, as an example. And then also, very importantly, the second limb is that when there's no longer an emergency, or when it's clear that the emergency wasn't an emergency at all in our case, then the power has passed. So they no longer have power, if they ever had power, to do these things when the COVID-19 disease isn't that bad. It's not killing everyone. It's not like the bubonic plague killing 1/3 of Europe's population. Next, we'll go to the Victorian Charter of Human Rights as just one example. So it's got 20 fundamental human rights injected into the Charter. And when the government passes a law, basically they have to state how it complies with the Charter. It should really apply to regulations or orders as well, at least significant ones like a state of emergency, that kind of thing. So going to the rights under the Charter, so you've got right to equity or equality before the law, and the right to life, so that includes liberty as well anyway, protection from torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, such as being locked in your house and fined if you sit down at a bar, at a park, or even a bar, or a seat at a shopping centre. You also have the right to free movement. I'll go into the actual charter afterwards. This is just a summary of it. You have a right to privacy and your reputation, so that includes that you shouldn't have police or army personnel questioning if you're not suspected or acting suspicious of conducting some kind of indictable offence. They shouldn't ask you, and you shouldn't have to answer what you're doing by walking down the street if you are exercising, or if you are meeting with someone, or going to the beach, or sunbathing, or whatever. You also have the right to freedom of thought, consciousness, religion and belief. So, you have the right to protest these things, even under the Human Rights Charter in Victoria. You have the right to freedom of expression, again the same thing. You have the right to protest, peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. So you can see it's not really just about unions, but you can go meet with your friends despite garbage claims that, you can only meet with one other person if they don't live in your household, that kind of thing. You have the rights of protection of your family and children. A few weeks ago or a couple of months ago, you could get arrested or have your kids taken off you for neglect, for not taking your children out to get sunlight and fresh air and whatever. Now, unfortunately, you can get the same thing happening if you don't go out. If you do go out. So, you go to take your kid to the park and you'll get a massive fine, and tell the police that you're not going to pay the fine, that it's invalid law, and see what happens. You also have the right to take part in public life. Again, the freedom of expression. And also public life. You have the right to go out even though it's referring here to run for a public office, in which case then you have the right to express yourself again anyway, because people need to be able to know who you're going to vote for. And anyway, but you should have the right to public life, as in to go out in public as well. You also have cultural rights. Today is ANZAC Day, and people are being banned from attending ANZAC Day ceremonies. I used to play bagpipes every ANZAC Day. You'd wake up at probably 3 in the morning, get ready, go do dawn service, and go do another one, and go do a big street march in Newcastle, New South Wales, then go to the RSL club, Newcastle RSL. I was in Newcastle RSL pipe band. Then do some evening services as well. And Aboriginal persons hold distinct cultural rights. So, extra protection there. Also, it is a holiday, or holy day, as holiday really stands for. So you have the right to memorialise and worship. It's not really worshipping, but, thanking the people for their sacrifices for ANZAC Day, for protecting our freedoms that we don't have anymore. Property rights. So taking your property can have many forms. It can be constructive taking, like people being fined for having birthday parties in their own house because they've got more than one person from another household in their house. That also in terms of the federal legislation, and then also territory legislation such as the Northern Territory and ACT, goes against the right to get compensated on just terms for the loss of property rights. You have the right to liberty and security of the persons, so you can go outside. It does say except in accordance with law, and not be arrested or detained. You're detained at your house. You're under house arrest, really. You just have leave to go out and buy some food. And then, again, deprivation of liberty. About criminal processes, this refers specifically to children, but there's other laws that say about other criminal processes that you can't be punished for a crime that you haven't done. For one, the regulations aren't crime legislation anyway, but also the fact is that people are being treated like criminals for no reason. Just everyday Joe blogs, just for going out of their house, or not even for going out of their house, for a disease that is a very weak disease that has killed hardly anybody in Australia, and that includes with false statistics being used. Right to criminal proceedings, the same thing, right to a fair hearing. So, and not to be tried or punished more than once. So, really, if you go out of your house once and you get a fine for sitting at the beach, really you should be able to continue sitting at the beach. But anyway, another point I'd like to make is with the freedom of expression and public life political rights, then the mere fact of not complying with the invalid legislation or invalid regulation, that makes it a political statement in itself. So again, you're protected. So here's an actual charter. So obviously this is a bit bigger than the summarized version, but I'll just go to one section in this. Freedom. You also have the right to earn a living and stuff like that as well under various charters, but I'm just concentrating on, well, may as well do two things. So freedom of movement. Every person lawfully within Victoria has the right to move freely within Victoria and to enter and leave it, and has the freedom to choose where to live. So if you have these border obstacles, border restrictions, that's a breach of freedom of movement. Also privacy and reputation. So let's just keep it at subsection A. Then it's probably clause actually. Is it an actual act? Yeah, it's an act, so subsection. Clauses really relate to regulations and sections to acts, despite what people claim about the so-called covering clauses of the Constitution of Australia. So you have the right not to have your privacy, family, home, or correspondence unlawfully or arbitrarily interfered with. That includes, people being told they can't have visitors in their house, people being demanded where they are walking or travelling, or why they're driving in a car, why they're crossing a border. It's none of the government's business, quite frankly, unless a person is reasonably suspected of being about to commit a indictable offence, really. Or if there's, say, a roadblock set up because there was a crime committed in the area and they've got to search people's cars or something like that. But that again's a separate thing. So then in Queensland, we've got the Human Rights Act. So it started on the 1st of January. So this is obviously written before the fact. So you got 23 fundamental human rights. So an extra 3 than Victoria does. This includes the freedom of movement, freedom of expression, property rights, privacy, reputation, cultural rights, generally, and for ANZAC people, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the right of liberty and security of your person. So it's probably pretty much a copy of the Victorian one anyway, in terms of what rights it protects. And with the extra 3, then perhaps it just, adds a couple, or maybe it splits some of them up. So this should have the full act. So I'll just write movement, freedom of movement. So section 19. Every person lawfully within Queensland has the right to move freely within Queensland and to enter and leave it, and has the freedom to choose where to live. Yet the Queensland government has border passes. So you cannot enter the state unless you have a border pass, or leave the state, one of the two. Maybe it's both. Unfortunately, I don't have a working car at the time, otherwise I'd go find out. You also have the rights for taking part in public life again. So, blah, blah, blah. Just try and see if there's anything interesting extra to quickly add. You also have, with the economic, social and cultural rights, I'll try and find economic rights, Division 3. So you have the right to public education as well. And someone asked me a question about why so-called essential service workers are allowed to get free childcare, and is that not discrimination? But as I told him, then I'm not up to date on that stuff, so I don't wish to be an ultra-crepidarian. I don't want to make claims that I can't back up, make claims about certain things that I don't know about. That doesn't say much about economic rights, does it, in Division 3 there? Next we have the Biosecurity Act 2015, Commonwealth Law. Section 28 states, freedom of interstate trade, commerce and intercourse. Intercourse is just travelling. So a power or function conferred by this Act must not be exercised or performed in such a way as to contravene Section 92 of the Constitution, trade and commerce among the states to be free. That's just a nickname for it. or Section 69 of the Australian Capital Territory Self-Government Act 1988, or Section 49 of Northern Territory Self-Government Act 1978, and they basically just mirror Section 92 of the Constitution. Of course, the federal government can make laws for the territories, and it has done so. That's why they're particularly mentioned in this section. Next, we have Section 92 of the Biosecurity Act. Receiving a vaccination or treatment, an individual may be required by a human biosecurity order to receive at a specified medical facility a specified vaccination or specified form of treatment in order to manage the listed human disease specified in the order and any other listed human disease. And note, for the manner in which this biosecurity measure must be carried out, see Section 94. So that's about mandatory vaccination and or other treatments, which goes against Section 51, subsection 23 of the Commonwealth Constitution. And we'll go through Section 93 is about receiving medication. That again, and some people are being confused by may. The may does not mean you have a choice. The may means that the decision maker making a human biosecurity control order has the choice. So they don't have to give you a vaccine, but they can order that you must have a vaccine. So in Section 94, so they've got appropriate medical or other standards to be applied. We do have Section 95, which is seen or could be seen as a protection against compulsory vaccination or compulsory medication, but it is in fact not one. So it says, no use of force to require compliance with certain biosecurity measures. Force must not be used against an individual to require the individual to comply with a biosecurity measure imposed under any of sections 85 to 93, so that included 92 and 93 obviously. Note, force may be used in preventing an individual leaving Australian territory in contravention of a traveller movement measure, see section 101, or in detaining a person who fails to comply with an isolation measure, see section 104. So they can just say you're isolated, so therefore you have to take the vaccine, or as I said yesterday, if someone resists getting injected, then that can throw this whole section out the window, because then they have to hold you down to stop you hurting anyone or hurting yourself and then inject you anyway. So go quickly to 104. So that relates to rules relating to detention. So a person, the officer, must not use more force or subject an individual, the detainee, to greater indignity than is necessary and reasonable to detain the detainee or to prevent the detainee from escaping. So they can use force anyway. I had the wrong order for this. So there's a column Whitfield again about section 92 of the Constitution. Here we've got the Australian Capital Territory Self-Government Act of 1988, Commonwealth Parliament. Within that, section 69, trade and commerce to be free. Subject to subsection 2, trade, commerce and intercourse between the territory and a state, and between the territory and the Northern Territory, Norfolk Island, the Jervis Bay Territory, the territory of Christmas Island, or the territory of Cocos Keeling Island shall be absolutely free. Subsection 1 does not bind the Commonwealth. So that's a bit silly anyway, because it's not subsection 1 that binds the Commonwealth, it's section 92 of the Constitution. But again, anyway, look, you can't have these restrictions to the free movement of Australians over internal borders unless they're, you know, fleeing a police pursuit or something like that. Next, we have the Northern Territory Self-Government Act of 1978. So section 49, this is more straightforward than the ACT version without any purported exceptions, which are no exceptions at all. So section 49, trade and commerce with states to be free. Trade, commerce and intercourse between a territory and the states, whether by means of internal carriage or ocean navigation, shall be absolutely free. Next we have the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900 UK or Imperial. So this is also nicknamed COACA, COACA, or the Constitution, the Australian Constitution, whatever you want to call it. Some people claim the Australian Constitution isn't the same thing, but they're incorrect. So this relates to Australia being a self-governing colony and still a part of the UK. So we look here. Where is it? So this is a preamble, and notice that it also mentions Almighty God. So Australia is actually a Christian nation, so it doesn't refer to various other gods, but as you can see, Australia is referred to as an Australasian colony. So we're a colony in possession of the Queen. So the Queen actually literally owns all of Australia. It extends to the Queen's successors. So some people try and claim that Queen Elizabeth II isn't a successor to Queen Victoria. That's just ludicrous and ridiculous. And I have videos including TINLA 10 and TINLA 11 that discusses say Stephen Spires and Juha Kiskanen's false claims about the Queen allegedly having a Catholic crown and all this other stuff. As you can see in so-called covering clause number 5, which is actually section 5 of the full act. So it says that the laws made shall be binding on the courts, judges and people of every state and every part of the Commonwealth, notwithstanding anything in the laws of any state, and it's in force on all British ships besides the naval ones. So the law applies to all. Next we have so-called covering clause 8, which is really section 8 of the full act, that the Commonwealth shall be taken to be a self-governing colony for the purpose of that act, of the Colonial Boundaries Act. But we are a self-governing colony. So going to section 51, which are the concurrent powers, so parliaments that the states and the Commonwealth also have. You go down, subsection 23A, it goes on about certain welfare benefits like maternity allowances, widows' pensions, child endowment, unemployment, pharmaceuticals, sickness benefits, blah blah blah. As you can see, it also includes a separate, completely different limb of things that aren't related to welfare, and that is the provision of medical and dental services, but not so as to authorise any form of civil conscription. So you cannot be forced into medicine. That includes also like similar things are the Nuremberg codes, where you can't forcibly experiment or do medical procedures on people. So that relates to the mandatory vaccination and some other things as well. You can't have slavery for medical and dental services. Next we have section 92 of the Constitution, which technically is really section 9 subsection 92 of the full act, but no one ever refers to it as that, besides myself, I guess. So the important parts: intercourse among the states, whether by means of internal carriage or ocean navigation, shall be absolutely free. And then it just has some little exceptions about with the transition period, that kind of thing, between being the separate multiple colonies to the separate single colony of the federated quasi-government of Australia, quasi-national system, quasi-country, whatever you call it. Next we have section 117, rights of residence in states. A subject of the Queen, resident in any state, shall not be subject in any other state to any disability or discrimination which would not be equally applicable to him if he were a subject of the Queen resident in such other state. So that does have some minor exceptions as per case law, such as, you know, if you're a New South Welshman or New South Welsh woman, you can't vote in Queensland state elections, that kind of thing, but they're very, very narrow exceptions. Crossing state borders and being forced to go into quarantine for 14 days if you're not a resident is in fact, you know, prohibited. I'm submitting. You also have things about excise taxes and whatever in crossing state borders, but, you know, this video can't go on forever. Next we have section 7 and 24 of the Constitution. So that is about voting, and that has been interpreted by the High Court as giving the so-called implied right to political communication. As I stated, any form of non-observance with these invalid regulations, for one, the regulations are invalid. For two, it is a political statement in itself, and therefore political protest in itself, therefore protected by the Constitution. There have been cases too where this right was used against purported legislation, such as, when was that? There was a World Catholic Youth Day, whenever that was, in Sydney, and there were laws purported laws, because they're invalid, stating that people could not harass the Catholic procession. And there was a group who went around, they were giving out condoms to the Catholics and coat hangers representing abortions before it was legalized. And they were arrested and they won in federal court because it was unconstitutional. It was their right to political communication as per the Constitution. So the legislation in, I assume it was New South Wales, because I'm pretty sure it was in Sydney, this procession, it could have been Victoria though, but I'm pretty sure it was Sydney. But it was ruled invalid or deemed invalid, shown it to be invalid from the beginning anyway. This little article talks about the implied freedom of political communication. So basically there was sorry, I'm losing my voice. So there was Lang versus a Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Lang was a New Zealand Prime Minister, and he tried suing for defamation and was ultimately unsuccessful. There were two limbs of the implied freedom of political communication. It's commonly cited as just being sections 7 and 24, although it really applies to 64 and 128 as well. So, for example, for section 128, that people have the right to discuss things that are subject to a referendum, as another example. But usually, people just say 7 and 24 instead of 7, 24, 64, 128. There's probably other provisions really that it applies to as well. So there was a two-limb test in the Lang case. Firstly, does the law effectively burden freedom of communication about government or political matters, either in its terms, operation, or effect? So if you get a yes, then you move on to limb 2, which is, was such a restriction reasonably appropriate and adapted to serve a legitimate end, to the fulfillment of which is compatible with the maintenance of the constitutionally prescribed system of representative and responsible government in a procedure prescribed by section 128 of submitting a proposed amendment of the Constitution to the informed decision of the people. So with this second limb, people usually just quote the first bit of it. If the law effectively burdens the freedom and if it's reasonably appropriate and adapted to serve a legitimate end, but they leave this part off, which is very important, which also narrows the feature, which is the fulfillment of which is compatible with the maintenance of the constitutionally prescribed system of representative and responsible government, ... Then it goes on about Coleman and Power. So that was basically a person was charged. He was alleging corruption of police, including Constable Power. Constable Power then went to get the pamphlet off the person and then arrested the person. When he was pushed backwards with the person shouting out, "Constable Brendan Power, corrupt police officer," quote unquote. And the appellant was then arrested for using insulting language, supposedly, and that was part of the Vagrancy Act, or the Vagrant Gaming and Other Offences Act in Queensland, and basically it went to the High Court and it got deemed that it was unconstitutional, that the gentleman had the right to, the implied right to political communication about government matters, police officer being a government official, and then also about policies, that kind of thing. Next we have the Human Rights Commission. So this has about some different anti-discrimination acts. This is humanrights.gov.au. So you've got age discrimination, disability discrimination, racial discrimination, sex discrimination. Then the Australian Human Rights Commission Act 1986, which includes certain treaties. Treaties aren't actually law within Australia even when they're signed up to, unless it is put into domestic legislation, but it can be used to interpret ambiguous sections of law to make it have, say, a narrower meaning so that it complies with the international treaty obligations. But international law is no law at all, really, until it is put into domestic legislation. So the Australian Human Rights Commission Act did put these following acts into domestic law, and these other acts are also based on international treaties such as Racial Discrimination Act, etc. But with these ones, it includes the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the about respect of employment and occupation. So that also is about from the International Labour Organisation, includes things like about unionism, rights of persons with disabilities. Billy Bob wants to sit down at a park bench because he's got a sore back, as an example, and then the police go and arrest the person or fine them $1,600 for sitting there is ridiculous. Rights of child, covenant and declaration, all these sorts of things. There are other ones as well, as you can see on the screen there. But with the Human Rights Commission Act, I'll just quickly look up freedom. There's 38 freedoms of freedom of thought. So with the schedules of this act, that puts into force the international obligations. So it's a ratification of the treaties into domestic laws. So as you see, Article 17, that covers about interference with privacy, family, home correspondence, blah, blah, blah. So that again, I've already covered these things, but it's just reiterating the point that, police can't demand where you're going if you're not reasonably suspected of committing a crime. The government can't tell you how many people you can have in your private home, that kind of thing. You have the right to freedom of thought. You have the right to, hold opinions without interference, freedom of expression, freedom of protest here. So, go out and protest these laws. It's suggested, but not an actual legal recommendation or anything like that. You have the freedom of association with others. You can go and meet with 100 people at the beach and, be within 1.5 meters of them. You also have trying to look for something in particular. Maybe I'll just type movement. So you also see this is also highlighted down the bottom as well. That's not so important actually. Movement. So Article 12. Everyone lawfully within the territory of a state shall, within that territory, have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence. So that means you can go from Queensland and New South Wales or Tasmania or whatever. And this is Schedule 2, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's just another example. There's also about medicine, medical services. Let's quickly look. Medical. Article 7. No one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, such as removing the rights of gregarious, or another word for gregarious is animals that like hanging around together, such as humans. So banning gregarious creatures from hanging around others in a social environment. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. That includes vaccines. Particularly someone could say, even though all vaccines are really experimental and they're always collecting data on it, so it's really just a giant experiment, but especially experimental brand new vaccines, such as for the novel coronavirus, SARS coronavirus number 2, as an example, for the vaccination stuff. You'll have about employment. There's so many different parts of employment here, references to it, but I'll just quickly try and find one if it's not too annoying. But anyway, so someone else can go through the employment part, because otherwise this video is going to be too long. But if you want to have your business open, like there was a Warners Bay in New South Wales lady who was running a remedial massage business, and she has the right to employment. Employment includes self-employment, and she was fined for massaging people one-on-one. Yet that's only one person anyway. So, you also have the right to have, there's all these shops that have these signs up saying, we're only allowed to have 3 people in your shop at once. That is ridiculous as well. That limits their employment opportunities and their right to earn $1, to earn some money, to make a living for themselves, to afford their rent or their mortgage repayment, or buy their food or their Ferrari or whatever the hell they want to do with their money. It is their money, despite the government taking, so much of it in taxes, indirect and direct. It's just another example. Anyway, this is about the Vlad laws, the Queensland Vicious Lawless Establishment, Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act. So Vlad also famously was Vlad the Impaler, who's either loved by certain people, such as his own people, and I think the Germans either loved him or hated him, and then the Russians either loved him or hated him. It might be that the Germanic people hated him and called him basically a ghoul or Dracula or whatever, and the Russians might be the ones that actually like him. So then that was going to be challenged in a high court by this particular individual, because there were various court cases involving such legislation, but then they got rid of the act because it was ridiculous anyway. It was excessively harsh, as it says there, but that was for people that were deemed to be criminals. Yet everyone is currently being deemed to be criminal, because we're having the same, prohibitions against us. So, as you'll see, it's in the repealed legislation on the Queensland legislation website. So, where is it? There, 2013. And then for definition, so who this applied to was any group of 3 or more persons by whatever name called, whether associated formally or informally, and whether the group is legal or illegal. So legal groups had this garbage applied to them. But we've all got this applied to us now. Any 3 or more people that aren't living in the same household can get fined for hanging out together. That's so ridiculous. That includes, there's other regulations for different numbers of people for funerals and weddings, but same difference. And with the bikies, there were, certainly funerals and weddings that people couldn't attend because they happened to be in a motorcycle club. So this is just doing some quick numbers. So you put the amount of deaths, 78, so this is for Australia, divide that by the total of confirmed and recovered cases, i.e. how many people have gotten the coronavirus, and times it by 100, so you get a percentage, and you see that 0.6% or 0.7% if you want to round it up to the nearest decimal place of people with coronavirus have died from it. So that's not very severe at all, and that also ignores the so-called comorbidities, where someone goes in to the hospital with a heart attack that they were going to have anyway, but they get tested and they happen to have coronavirus, so that gets declared a coronavirus death. So you can do the worldwide one as well. So just quickly do that as well, even though the statistics are basically fake. What's that? 2.7. Yeah, I'll just do it this way. Divide it by 1,000. So So you get about 5.4, 5.5 if you want to round it up, percent of people supposedly with coronavirus have died from it worldwide. Yet we know that the statistics are fake for that. And I'll get on to why in a second. So a Oxford University study from more than a month ago, so it was reported on a month ago, so how old's this actual study, suggested that 50% of the UK's population was already infected by the coronavirus. And sure, this says slammed by experts. Why doesn't it say slammed by people on a gravy train? But that's beside the point. Also, there was another interesting thing for the Pierbright Institute vaccine patent, that there's an 18-month delay between applying for a patent and for it being listed. That way it protects people a little bit more. So who knows what patents have been taken out for this COVID-19 type coronavirus that aren't listed, and who's going to be on a gravy train. We also see ridiculous overreach again, where there's a plane club. You see this beautiful P-51D World War II Mustang US aeroplane, even though that's a UK Rondel. Of course, the P-51 became an important plane when England basically did like a Lend-Lease thing with the US so they could escort their bombers and also, you know, have a really powerful fighter plane. And then the Americans started using the plane that they invented to escort their own bombers, B-17s, B-24s, all the way to Berlin from the UK, because it was such a good warplane and had such awesome range, instead of, say, Spitfires or Hurricanes only being able to, and Kitty Hawks, whatever, only able to cover the bombers halfway to Berlin. But there's a nice little bit of garbage propaganda about flattening the curve. It'll be interesting to see if physical distancing ends at this point. Will shoot up, but it's lies. But anyway, so getting back to this, so there's a warbirds group at Caboolture Aerodrome, and they have, you know, some cool warbirds or old World War II probably fighter planes and whatever else they got. So they've been banned because of this stupid restriction thing. You also see this garbage propaganda to control the COVID-19 outbreak. We need to keep the growth factor below 1, and it's currently 0.72. Yet that's garbage again. And then you're saying about there's 6 people on ventilators. How many ventilators do we have in Australia? How many hospital beds? 100,000 hospital beds, and there's 18 people with COVID-19. But anyway, so I'll just quickly find, I did have a peruse of this. So there were people that were in 4 separate planes from 4 separate hangars, and they were going to do a little flyover that they always do. That's part of their cultural heritage and protected by law, and they were banned at doing it. So Mr. Crisafulli argued the 4 planes were each flying solo and departing from separate hangars. So he's actually a LNP member of parliament, and it was still banned. You know, what, the person's going to cough in their own plane and give themselves a disease that they didn't have, or a disease that they did have, and they're going to reinfect themselves, supposedly. So this says, we're in it for the long term. It's not over all of a sudden. This is all garbage. An Israeli professor has already shown that places with lockdowns have the exact same pattern of infection than places that are free. So you got if physical distancing begins at this point and ends at this point, and it'll go woo. But this again shows a point I'm about to make anyway, that is about incubation periods for the disease, but I'll save that for the correct section. So this is about the growth factor of the disease and how other countries are doing. It'll be interesting. Look, China's down 0.24, yet they don't even have a vaccine. So how'd they do it? And obviously, if they cured everything, then vaccines are not required. We do know that they do use certain drugs that are banned in Australia. I want to just quickly see Italy. There's Italy. 0.99, oh, it's right on the edge. And Spain. It's interesting, but anyway. So, with Australia, the lockdown started on the 29th of March. So as you see, the curve was already flattening, and this isn't the actual curve. The actual curve is using a logarithmic scale. But as you see, the number of cases declined drastically here and then drastically there. Yet we know that the illness has a 2-week incubation period. So therefore, the graph should still keep going up for at least 2 weeks after the lockdown. So that brings us to here. That should be massively high, but I would argue that it should keep going exponentially after the lockdown, because then people that had the disease are infecting their family members or people they live with, their flatmates or whatever. So it shouldn't be for another 2 weeks after the 13th that the illness starts declining at all. So that would be the 29th of April, which we're not even at. So this graph itself shows that the lockdowns have no causal relationship to a decrease in cases, and it's all garbage. There should be massively huge spike. It should be thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions with the illness, and then all of a sudden it should drop off after the 29th. And that is not what has happened. You'll also see here, so this is total number of infections, confirmed cases. Remember, they don't actually test everyone. If they tested everyone, I should have closed that other previous window, but if all Australians were tested, all people in Australia were tested, then despite the negative or false negatives and false positives and coronavirus tests that are contaminated with coronavirus because they come from China, and is that done intentionally? Maybe. But, there's probably really 16 million people in Australia that have already been exposed to the virus. And, then it goes from, 0.6% down to 0.0006%. I don't remember the actual figures it was for how many people were supposed to be infected. I think about 11,000. But, that the death rate is really tiny. Again, this shows the different dates. So it was already flattening here. If you do a normalized curve, it would go something like this and then start flattening here. Boom, before the lockdown existed. And then go down quite rapidly there. But they don't do it like that. And they do these dodgy graphs where they say, oh, this is from the 100th infection. just arbitrarily done like that because really to scam people, to be honest. So as you see, the curve has already started going down massively before this lockdown occurred. So the lockdown's here and it was already down from the peak. So that's using a model and that's using observed. And that's quite a wide band, which shouldn't be like that. But anyway, as you can see, it's already gone down before the lockdown. Yet it shouldn't go down for 4 weeks after the lockdown. 2 weeks for the incubation period, and then 2 weeks for those that can get infected when they're in a lockdown. Then you got how fast is it growing. So this is a logarithmic scale, but they're going from the 100th infection. So that makes this curve a lot more steep because really it's probably like, just say for Australia, like this or something like that. But they got it being really steep because they started at 100 instead of 0. And it is logarithmic as well, which means each time you go up one, it adds a 0 to the scale. So really it should have 2 more things down here. It should start at 0, then go 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, million, in which case that looks like it's inaccurate anyway because a million would be up here. And has a million US people been officially diagnosed with COVID-19? I don't think so, and that'd be pretty close to the million mark. So there's Australia. So this is what the flattening the curve actually relates to. And this isn't the number of new cases, this is the number of cases. So in other words, the line will flatten out, even though we know the testing regime is BS. Because sick people get tested and not healthy people, so therefore it artificially makes it look a lot worse than it is. So this has about flattening the curve. I'm looking for an actual curve graph, which I think I have somewhere. This one cover RO. No, but anyway, so you can't even read these graphs, but previous page covered that anyway. This is about how social distancing can end the illness. So they're talking about density of people there anyway, but we have open borders for immigrants to come from all sorts of places, including China, where the infection came from. So presumably China is in this grey section based on this. It is really Southeast Asia, but maybe other includes China because it's so big in the early stages. Yet this graph is pretty stupid that it doesn't define places, and as you see, the main places where the infections are in Europe. So Eastern Mediterranean, well, that's not really Europe, but Israel, Turkey. Turkey has a little bit of Europe that they stole many years ago and was never returned. There's Europe, and you've got the Western Pacific, so that'll be the Pacific Islanders, places like New Guinea and Micronesia, Macronesia, blah blah blah. Anyway, so they use this formula here, and this is for the reproductive ratio or rate. So R equals C times P times D, and this says C is the average number of people an infectious person comes into contact with each day, P is the probability of infecting a person, and D is the duration of the infection. So, you got the 14-day incubation period, and then however many days it takes to get over the illness, maybe it's another 14 days, something like that. And they're infectious for that period. So again, with the lockdown, that should really extend the period in which we shouldn't see any decline in the number of new cases, even more than the 4 weeks that I suggested, because you might have 2 weeks of infection, and that's how it is. But anyway, so just having a quick look at this. So this is from the World Health Organization about transmission cycles, reproductive ratio, which is what we want. So this basically is, if one person's infected, how many people does that infection get transferred to, and then so on and so forth. So you can see the rate of infection, basically. So you've got components of the reproductive ratio of an infectious disease. R equals C, which is further defined than what the other page said, which is the average number of susceptible people, i.e. those not infected and can contract the infection, that an infectious person comes into contact with per unit of time, e.g. per day. P is the probability the transmission will take place per unit contact. And D, duration of the infection or infectious period, e.g. in days. So, someone might be infectious for 21 days, something like that. So when they're asymptomatic from, say, day 5 or something like that, and then a few weeks after or a couple of weeks after they are symptomatic, as an example. Then it's got that C has to be very context specific, so fecal oral contact, vector-bornes where, just say, like rabies or something like that. So if a raccoon bites someone, the raccoon is a non-human species that can have an illness and give that to humans. And then P greatly depends on the pathogen's virulence or how catchy it is. And also really it's how deadly it is too, because if a illness is very deadly, then the host often dies before infecting many other people. So this is a bit stupid anyway, this formula, and should be updated. And D is affected by host pathogen interactions, so it's really for the amount of time. But really there's 2 problems with this that I've just come up with. One is it does not take into consideration the number of people or the proportion of people that are actually infected, which drastically reduces this number potentially. And then also with the virulence, if they're just counting that as a probability of transmission taking place, it does not take into consideration the deadliness of the illness. So how likely it is to kill, how quickly it kills. So quickly, I guess, can be really under D, but it does not actually state that. So if someone dies on day 1, that doesn't change the average duration of infectiveness for that particular individual because it's aggregate. But anyway, that's getting a bit complicated. So that's called a RO number. And anyway, so with the C pronumeral, that would be for air droplets, and also, as you can see, these videos before they get censored, with a lot of certain people that go spitting on seats, blowing their nose, rubbing it on seats in park benches. There was a woman doing that behind a man. There's a woman in Victoria, I think it was, spitting all over bananas, people blowing their nose and spitting on seats, people blowing their nose and spitting on and wiping the snot as well on buttons in elevators and door handles. There's been videos of, and magically these keep being taken down, maybe because they had some kind of similarity in the ethnicity of the people that were recorded doing that, whatever that means. But anyway, so close that one and that one. That's a reproductive ratio again. So as you can see, there's flights from Australia all over the place. This is a flight tracker called flightaware.com. There's been planes coming from Wuhan, China. They've got different representations. So these big planes are like the big commercial airliners. You've got that jets. You've got little propeller plane pictures. You've got the different airports, major international airports in Australia. So here's one from Hong Kong, going to MLN as an example, which is a bit weird. Wasn't it over Australia? Oh no, where was it? It seems to be going a weird direction to go to Manila, which is over here. So anyway, that's interesting. So earlier today, there was, when I find it, a plane from Shenzhen, China, Guangdong province, where your electronics comes from. Well, that one's actually going to Shenzhen. But obviously it came from China probably before that anyway, because it's a Chinese airline plane and just go back and forth probably. So even if we locked down all of Australia and got rid of the disease completely, the virus, then all it takes is one person from an infected country or an infected person to go to the country, and then we have to get locked down again forever. Until, as Scott Morrison says, there's a vaccine. Thanks, Bill Gates. Or criminal like GPS tracking for every individual, or 40% of them, blah, blah, blah. Here you go, here's Taipei Airport, Taiwan, which is, when China got taken over by the communists, the government basically fled to Taiwan, and that's why you have two Chinas. Well, really, there's three Chinas, because Hong Kong's supposed to be run as a separate China as well until a certain period. This is quite cool too. You see the altitude of the planes and how fast they go and whatever over the duration of the trip. So now we have the restricted access to designated areas direction. So you have these chief health ministers using their emergency powers to declare public health emergencies under Section 326 of the Public Health Act in Queensland, as an example. So Dr. Jeanette Young, she so-called reasonably believes it's necessary to give these following directions, and I don't want to go on forever, but I better scroll down just so you can see what this is. It's got about permitted purposes, reasons why you can go outside, which is ridiculous in itself, but to obtain essential goods and services, to get medical treatment, blah, blah, blah. And I state that this is invalid. They have 100 penalty units. Penalty unit in Queensland might be about $100, something like that, so $10,000 fines. And it's completely ridiculous. So you've also got home confinement, movement and gathering direction. Again, it covers, you can't leave your home unless you've got special permission, that kind of thing. Which again is ridiculous. You can only have 2 visitors at your household, which again is ridiculous and I state illegal, unlawful. Penalties, 100 penalty units again. In terms of ScoMo, Scott Morrison's GPS idea, having everyone have to have a mobile phone and carry it with them at all times, charged, and a GPS app on, in which case the police can already access your GPS when your phone's on, but making you think that you have a choice, and there could be issues as to lawfulness of what is being done. It's like Edward Snowden with the US prison program, where he revealed certain information. It wasn't just metadata being collected, that all your data is collected for everything you ever do on the internet and on your phone and whatnot. But Queensland, quite controversially, it's been updated now, but I think it happened maybe a year or two ago, they made it that people that are domestic violence perpetrators that have done strangulation have to have a GPS tracking device, just like sex offenders. And the reasoning behind that is claims that women who are strangled are 750 times more likely to die either at the time of the strangulation or anywhere up to 12 months after it. It's a lethal form of violence. So obviously, with that being so high, that means that most people aren't likely to die, because most people aren't weirdos and don't strangle people. Although I get that some people like doing that for adult activities in a consensual manner, but is it counting that? Who knows? So they're putting GPS tracking on these people, and there were human rights organisations coming out saying, you can't do this, this is so bad, but then the justification is this 750 times more likely to die. It would be helpful if the news bothered to have, some kind of reference instead of just Betty Taylor from the Red Rose Foundation. It also reminds me of the White Ribbon Foundation that was very anti-men, in my opinion, and manipulated statistics or provided a false sense of what's happening. There's claims something like one woman a week is dying from domestic violence in Australia, and that is terrible in itself, but for one, that implies that it's men doing it, even though there's many violent lesbians as well, as an example, and probably proportionally more so than heterosexuals, based on some studies I've seen before. Apparently homosexual relationships are very much more likely to be violent in nature than heterosexual relationships for whatever reason. Maybe that only applies to male same-sex partnerships, unions, that kind of thing. But I think just from memory off the top of my head, it also applied to lesbians as well. And anyway, so in reality, women in Australia kill their family members more than males, and that does not even include the 100,000 plus abortions per year, killing 100,000 Australians for whatever purpose. But there's often women killing men, and also women in particular killing their children, which you can see some little graphs of that statistics on, I think it's TINLA episode 2 or episode 3, that talks about Jodie Harrison, New South Wales MP, among other people, and also what happened in relation to someone related to me or formerly related to me that was being targeted by Labor Party people at the same time that they were celebrating, ban domestic violence against women kind of period. But anyway, so again, GPS trackings for paroled sex offenders, paroled strangulation perpetrators, and now the government wants everyone to do it, and blackmailing and doing under duress, saying you have to do it or else. Next we have the Public Health Act. So this includes, and this is a Queensland one, I should say. So this includes particular powers for COVID-19 emergency, and it goes on about Chief Health Officer, so that's the Dr. Jeanette Young, and that they have power to give directions. These directions must be in writing, and also it does say, what's it saying? So it has to comply with certain things, but I'll just gloss over some things because otherwise this is going to be a 3-hour long video. So a public health emergency can be declared. It has to be by the minister and also by a reasonable person by extension of that, because the minister has to be a reasonable person, that there is a public health emergency and that it is necessary to exercise powers under this chapter to prevent or minimize serious adverse effects on human health. And as we're about to see in this little link, Israeli professor of epidemiology already went through the patterns of infection with people under lockdown and people not being locked down in countries around the world, and it has the same pattern, whether there's a lockdown or not, but one destroys an economy and one does not. So it goes on what an emergency officer is. It can be a general one or a medical one. A medical one has to be a doctor or, equivalent. It can be nurses, probably. Power to enter places. So emergency officers have certain powers, and this is after a valid declaration has been declared. So a medical officer, emergency officer, has extra powers, and people have to comply, otherwise get, potentially $20,000+ fine. The chief executive can make orders for detention as well. Again, it has to be in writing, must be in writing, and must state the following: that, they've got a reason for locking a person up, that these are the reasons, blah, blah, blah. And it does actually say the person, so it applies to individual persons. It shouldn't be a blanket statement, hey, we're going to lock up everyone in Queensland, blah, blah, blah. There is compensation, but it does not relate to the COVID-19 problems with these emergency officers. So compensation, there's entitlements to compensation, but it does not apply to loss or damage from the power that was exercised or purportedly exercised in relation to the COVID-19 emergency. So purportedly exercised means it was an invalid order or direction, and they still won't give you compensation under their claim legislation, even though, there's a reason why Queensland's supposed to have an upper house and why technically all of their legislation since 1922 is invalid, even though there were attempts to try and hide the fact, including the 1977 Commonwealth referendum on one of the 4 points that was done at that time period. But that's subject for another video. So the exemption for the compensation doesn't relate to these powers of emergency officers or extra powers of medical emergency officers. So the shutdowns were pointless all along. I have that open here. I should already close this search bar thing. So this is Israeli epidemiologist professor, and he's concluded that, I better say his name, where is it? Should be Ben Israel. Oh, so this one in particular is about Israel's stopped the lockdown and they're not going to lock people down again. They're not going to have a lockdown. They're not going to continue to destroy their economy. It's interesting what Israel looks like. So this, which is, what was it? The American Family Association, I think it was called. It was just that previous article that I found. It mentions the name of the doctor. I've already read other things about the doctor, but so his name is Yitzhak Ben Israel of Tel Aviv University, and he might even be a vested interest in saying the opposite of what he actually concluded, like potentially, as a motivation to lie for the pharmaceutical companies. But he concluded that the coronavirus runs its own course no matter what the government does or does not do. So he compared rates in the US, UK, Sweden, Switzerland, blah, 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 and came to the conclusion that the quarantine or lockdowns really, so quarantining the healthy people, does nothing to change how things go. So let's click this link. Should say about a 6-week pattern. This is Town Hall. I've already got this link clicked here. So the professor plotted the rates of coronavirus infections, and they've all got identical infectious patterns. So the number of infected people peaks at the 6th week, and then rapidly subsides by the 8th week. That doesn't mean that you can't have a cyclical pattern where it'll go up and down, but the point is that if you have a lockdown or no lockdown, then you get the same results in terms of infections and infectious rates. Therefore, it is not reasonable nor appropriate, proportionate, adapted to save people to have these lockdowns. It does nothing. I can't read Hebrew, but blah, 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 blah. Read it backwards. So this is a lockdown effect. All this false attribution of saving lives to the lockdown, which couldn't possibly be the reason for the decline in the graph, as I've stated multiple times. So this is traffic speeds in Sydney. So look, there's people can get everyone locked down and then they can have the roads to themselves. Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide. So this is declines in traffic in the areas tested. So there's been 50% less people in retail and recreation. I imagine it's actually a lot higher than that. It depends on how they define recreation things as well. You know, if you ban everyone from the beach, then it's probably right down. People banned from parks, and does say recreation as opposed to exercise as well. So therefore the exemptions of exercise shouldn't even be applicable to that. There's parks separately, so why is that not included in that? That's another problem with statistics. It's like Bill Gates with his book that he has in his little pile in one of his videos, How to Lie with Statistics. And I'll do a screenshot of that in a different TINLA episode that covers, you know, a bunch of memes and screenshots of things. So quickly scrolling down, what's that? Cities at a standstill, except in Asia. So, and isn't it amazing? You had places like Hong Kong and France and whatever that had all these massive protests, and in Spain, Catalonia, that all of a sudden the protests go away. Isn't that amazing with this lockdown? So I also have this open just to go to one of my videos. I encourage you to watch the videos. As you see, there's all these copyright strikes, which is invalid anyway because I don't break copyright law. How do I go to that thing? Just say. But those strikes are being reviewed anyway. So I just want to go to the comments here because Jeff Davidson wrote in relation to Cole and Whitfield about section 23, and I already mentioned that. He also mentions Cunliffe and the Commonwealth, and again just repeats that section 92 guarantees aren't absolute. So I replied that paragraph 2 stops things like fugitive crossing into different states, about the special constables, unlike the movies. What else? So I cover this quite extensively, and then I talk about quarantining is really for sick people, not locking up healthy people indefinitely, arbitrarily. That's illegal and void, and that I'm doing more videos. It is a valid question. That I prefer Gratwick and Johnson. You can't do italics on these comments as far as I know. So that was very broad back in 1945, and that said, even if the regulations and order apart from section 92 are completely valid, they cannot be upheld if they are inconsistent with section 100 or section 92. All the legislative powers given to the Commonwealth Parliament by section 51 of the Constitution are given expressly, subject to this Constitution. The defence power is no exception. Section 92 is a provision which introduces into substantive law of both Commonwealth and states a provision that, trade, movement, blah blah blah, is absolutely free. No statute or regulation or order made under a statute, whether by the Commonwealth or by the state, can repeal or modify this provision. It is a constitutional prohibition which is a limitation upon all legislative power. So then I talk about ratio disidendis and whatever. So that's about precedent. And with the Cunliffe case, that was, in my opinion, taking the mickey out of things to try and get around migration agent license laws. So basically someone was trying to be a migration agent and they weren't licensed to do so. They got in trouble for doing so. And then they tried using section 92 to say that they have communication with the government, so therefore they being protected, so therefore they don't have to comply with the licensing that is illegal. And then I made up a little example. It's akin to you trying to take Telstra to court demanding that you should have unlimited data on your phone for communicating, which is not what section 92's really intended to be about. And then also we should look at the historical reasons and rewards for federating in a single self-governing colony instead of many, i.e. things like the free movement of goods and people. And then also the court isn't bound by its own decisions, again with a big asterisk or exception, in that a single judge is bound by the full bench of the High Court, but again it can be distinguished and there's many other exceptions anyway. And that basically a court can make its own interpretations anyway. We do have judicial activism, so if you did have a bunch of psychopaths or corrupt people in the court, they could do whatever they want. They could say, it means this or that or that. And the lockdown also made a little quip that it wouldn't be so bad if we all lived in mansions by the water with our own tennis courts and pools and blah blah blah. And then Jeff Davidson said about, modern courts can do whatever they want. the ideal interpretation would be of Quick and Garran. If the High Court bothered to look, they'd see the intention was the right to travel unburdened by state restrictions, regulations or obstructions. I also put that Colin Whitfield was famous for using Quick and Garran because he mentioned about Quick and Garran, which if the High Court bothered to use it for Huddart, Parker and Moorhead, then which concerned corporations' powers, the right to create corporations, that, you know, that wouldn't have been an issue and they wouldn't have had to have done certain legal fictions, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I also point out about when an emergency is an emergency, which it's not really an emergency now, then the law has to be reasonably proportionate and appropriate. And then talked about lighthouses in the communist case. There's a new message here. What's this about? Section 117. Don't really have time to read that now, because otherwise the video will be longer. But I'll read that and respond to Jeff in a video, and you can read my comments there. So we also have Magna Carta. That was inherited by Australia, despite what some people falsely claim, including some people that do know better or ought to know better. We also have the Bill of Rights. These will be covered in different videos, including a reception of English law, about Section 24 of the 1828 Australian Courts Act as an example, and whatever. We also have the Australian Army with Operation COVID-19 Assist, and Chief of Army Lieutenant General Rick Burr. So this has certain pictures with the Army helping out, so helping pack medical supplies, and they were helping sew medical masks or operate the machines that make the medical masks in Australia that don't have stitching, technically. That they're helping people with their bags apparently at airports. That they are assisting the police, protecting the police. Really, they don't have guns, visible at least, but, you know, it's intimidating enough having the police at your door, let alone having army there as well. Don't know what that's supposed to be saying. No, he's a soldier returning home. Used to be not long ago that you couldn't have soldiers with tattoos, but they changed it. Obviously, they needed more troops. So this is Lieutenant General Rick Burr, and this is a Chief of Army's ANZAC Day message that I mentioned before. Give it a thumbs down. This is actually a separate one where they have turned the comments off. It has a lot more views than the one that I saw, which is in the next page, which was put by the Department of Defence as opposed to the Australian Army. Obviously, there are a lot of negative comments about the illegality of this action. So that compares to the Department of Defence's 200 views. And I'll play a little bit of the clip for you.
So as we commemorate this ANZAC Day, while we cannot physically stand together as we usually do, I ask that you find your own ways to do this in heart and mind. As you set the example and comply with government direction and restrictions, please continue to look out for each other.
So that's just ridiculous. The government is defending tyranny rather than freedom. You know, for these invalid, illegal laws that are to be disregarded by all people if they are invalid, as the Chief Justice of the High Court said. So I put, the Army should be standing up for freedoms that we had until a few weeks ago by the blood of our military and people on the home front, to ignore unconstitutional regulations, not order people to observe it, And then I have an extract from the first uniform tax case about invalid laws and regulations are no law at all. This is about the 18 months from patent application to it being public, i.e. with Bill Gates, etc., who may well be on a gravy train. He might well already have patents for the new vaccine that everyone has to use, and therefore it's really an investment. His little, it's not really little, but $250 million for donations and whatever to the efforts, and also his donations to the World Health Organization that some people claim is to buy influence, that kind of thing. And anyway, if you'd be able to donate some money to me, that would be very helpful. My address, you just go to paypal.me/Arjay Martin, and you can click next and donate some money. Thank you for your time. Please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Get this message out there, and as I say, I have references to back up my assertions, and here they are. There'll be another reference video too later on, maybe made in a couple of days or something like that, with a bunch of screenshots and memes, including more particularly claims that I've made in TINLA's 14 and 15 in relation to, certain aspects of that not covered in this. Thank you. Goodbye.